Welcome to this week's episode of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. I'm your host, Ron Campbell, and this week, as with every week, I want to start off by reminding you of the most important truth in the entire universe. God loves you. Now, last week we started a three-part journey, our kind of a three-part series, wrapping up a conclusion of how did we get here? Are we the product of intelligent design, or are we the product of a naturalistic approach, time, matter, and chance? And we talked a lot about why those are the two options. Everything else kind of falls within those two options. We talked a lot last week about what God of the gaps is and isn't. And I am not going to belabor those points again this week and next week. If you have any questions, I want you to encourage you to go back and watch last week's episode, because it really addresses this question of what do we all base our worldview on? What do we base that on, and what are we looking at? And we talked about the movie Casablanca, one of the greatest movies out there. And some examples from Casablanca to maybe help us along the way. So as we're looking at this and as we're talking about it, what I wanted to do this week is to briefly walk through the evidence that we've seen as it relates to the question of from nothing where the universe began to our little planet floating in space right before life begins. All right. So looking at that, it's been a long time since we've done those episodes. Those episodes are now well over a year old and going back probably a couple years now, looking at those. And as we talked about last week, the strength of the decision that we make is in the journey. It's not in any one given episode, all right? And so as we look at this, the contention that I've made is that the evidence that we've seen, the scientific evidence that we've seen, supports the conclusion that we are the product of an intelligent designer. And by designer, I mean what you will see. This isn't a question of, well, naturalism today can't put an answer on the table, and so we're just going to say it was God because we don't know any better. That is a God of the gaps approach, and we're not going to do that. The example that we used last week was this idea of the information contained in DNA. When we look at the information contained in DNA, what do we recognize? Well, in our experience, when we see computer programming, we recognize that computer programming is always the result of a programmer, of an intelligent mind, that it took an intelligent mind to create something like that. And so when we see the most complex programming that we've ever discovered, and we've asked the question, where did that come from? When we look at that, it's quite reasonable to say that the best explanation is that an intelligent mind had to be behind the computer programming that makes up us, that makes up all life around us. That could not have originated from time, matter, and chance. That we cannot get there by that path. And it's not just a question of, well, naturalism can't put an answer for how that might have happened on the table today. In our experience, there's not another answer to that question. We can safely conclude that the answer to the question, when we recognize the handiwork of intelligence and computer programming, that's not something that a future scientific discovery is ever going to change. And when we think about the idea that random mutation could have gotten us there, I want you to again think about your own computer. Is there ever a time when computer code on your computer randomly mutated ever results in an upgrade? No, this is why we buy new computers. They get tired and the operating system gets full of all sorts of mutations. And eventually we have to buy a new computer because the hardware's gotten old and the software has become corrupted through random mutation. And no good thing comes from that. So when we look at these steps along the way and we say the fingerprint of intelligence, I want you to recognize that intelligence doesn't just mean a programmer. Intelligence means an architect, or a designer. It means a builder. It means someone who put something together or who clearly brought into the equation something that could not have existed before, that in any area of our life we recognize that is the handiwork of intelligence. It is not unreasonable in those situations to conclude that the best explanation would be that of an intelligent creator. Now, at the same time, I'm going to call these fair as we're doing this. There are situations that we can look at and go, well, I mean, that could absolutely be the product of random chance. Even if it's incredibly unlikely, it's not impossible. And so if it's not impossible, we can't rule out that random chance could have resulted in something like, we'll talk about some of those here in a minute. So when we look at that, in that situation, we take a step back and we go, okay, it would be wrong to say that only intelligence could do that when random chance could also result in that. And so we'll look at those and we'll balance those out as we go forward. So let's talk about that today. And we'll draw our first set of conclusions as we walk through the journey from nothing to where we are today. And again, we're going to be honest about this as we go forward. There are some people who want to sneak something into nothing to kind of, maneuver around that. It's a great philosophical maneuver to get around nothing by sneaking something into nothing to then explain the something that we're trying to explain. Think about that. You'll get there with me. So nothing means nothing. It doesn't mean a quantum vacuum. It doesn't mean something that we observe on this side of the Big Bang, creation event, whatever you would like to call it. Nothing means nothing. All right, so we're going to hold to that. Again, if you want to talk further about, if you want to look more on that, there's previous episodes. Please go back and look at those previous episodes. We spend a lot more time on them. But tonight, let's talk about how we got from nothing to our little blue planet floating in space. And then next week, we will attempt to draw a conclusion on the jump from lifelessness to the abundant life that we see around us today. So let's start trying to draw a conclusion here as we look at this. The very first step that we looked at in this journey, and we spent a lot of time talking about it, was the jump from nothing to where we are today. Some people, again, refer to it as the Big Bang. That's the most common term that we know. Other people would say it's a creation event, whatever you want to call it, the idea of a beginning point of the universe. And what we recognize applying Einstein's general theory of relativity, Einstein's special theory of relativity, mentioned this briefly in other episodes, with Einstein's special theory of relativity. More recently, we would look at the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem. With Einstein's general theory of relativity, I think most recently we'd probably look at Hartle-Hawking. And we would look at these different theories. And what we would say is we recognize, again, that there was an absolute beginning point to the universe. I know Hawking has recently argued, in his last book before he passed away tragically, Hawking argued, last book or the book before, it might have been the book before, that you could, if you inserted imaginary numbers into Einstein's formula, you could actually curve that point to a place where you almost created an infinite curve, and you could kind of blur the beginning point. But when you put real numbers back into Einstein's equation, well, what you ended up with was an absolute beginning point. And I would honestly argue that even after he inserted pretend numbers into the equation, you still ended up with an absolute beginning point. But again, in previous episodes, what we recognize in an expanding universe, which we have, is that there was an absolute beginning point to the universe. And that to get a beginning point to the universe, we know that it could not have existed past eternal. The second law of thermodynamics tells us that. If the universe existed past eternal, at some point in the infinite past, the universe would have grown cold and died. And that has not happened. And so we know that the universe has not existed past eternal. The second law of thermodynamics tells us that as we go forward. So there's lots of different ways that we could look at this, but the most current scientific evidence that we have leads us to the conclusion that there was an absolute beginning point to the universe. The universe itself cannot explain its own existence. Nothing can explain, when you look at this, nothing material, and this was what we talked about, the Kalam cosmological argument. Nothing material can explain its own existence. So the Kalam cosmological argument tells us whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And so in looking at that, the cause of the universe has to be something that is timeless, spaceless, and immaterial, because in the creation event of the universe, the Big Bang, let's say, you created time, space, and matter. So time, space, and matter were all created in that event. So none of them can be the explanation for how the event occurred because they didn't exist prior to the event occurring. So you had to have an entity who was timeless, spaceless, and immaterial, of enormous power and enormous intelligence. We're going to learn that in the next one here when we talk about fine-tuning. And when we look at that, the only explanation that we can come away with is an intelligent mind is not the only explanation, the best explanation. Other arguments can be made, but I think they pale in comparison to the explanatory power of an intelligent mind being the best explanation for the beginning point of the universe based on what we know. Everything else that we try to insert in there, we have to insert some sort of a way to jump from nothing to everything. And again, from a material standpoint, there's no way to get past nothing to everything. It just simply doesn't occur. The second point that we looked at and talked about was the idea of the fine-tuning of the universe. This was first stumbled upon by Fred Hoyle, who was looking for an answer to where had carbon formed in the early stages of the universe. How did we get to us? Where does all the carbon come from? And what he came to quickly realize in looking at how carbon was created, that the fine-tuning of that simply defied explanation. And what Hoyle arrived at was the very first of what we recognize now are dozens of different parameters that the universe is built on that make not only life possible within the universe, but make the universe possible itself. And any one of these, if you change them, in some cases by even the most minute percentages, and in some cases by larger percentages, but changes to any of these, changes impact how all of them interact with each other in many cases. And changes to them have a cataclysmic effect on the formation, on the existence of the universe and the existence of life in the universe. And what scientists have come to understand over the last 50, 60 years especially, is that these finely tuned parameters are so specific and so mathematically improbable, each one of them, that when you put them all together, they form a mathematically impossible barrier that random chance simply cannot explain. Now, the universe is oftentimes put out on the table as, well, if you had an infinite number of universes, eventually you would get lucky and we're the product of that luck. And sure, that somehow makes sense. The problem that you have is, when you look at that, if you insert an infinite number of universes, you ultimately have to take another step backward and answer the question, well, what's creating all of these infinite numbers of universes and where are they going? Why are they running into each other? Why don't we have problems? Where's all this energy coming from that's powering this universe generating machine? There are so many problems with trying to insert, again, an infinite amount of luck into the situation to overcome it. A great many naturalists are starting to look at that and go, okay, the multiverse is maybe not a great way to explain how we get around the fine-tuning problem. Even Richard Dawkins, as of late, I'm paraphrasing from him, but he recently said in a podcast interview, is actually one of the best, maybe the only good argument that you could make to get to the proof for the existence of God. That's a huge admission coming from Dawkins. So when you look at those, again, when we see something that has been built, and you look around the universe at how the universe is put together, all of these finely tuned parameters, what you see is something that has been constructed by an engineer who has put such enormous care and effort into it that what holds the very fabric of the universe together is of such an order of magnitude improbable that the best, and I would argue only explanation for that, is the handiwork of intelligence. And so the very first two things that launch the universe and bring us to this point both point to, clearly, I believe, the true fingerprint of intelligence. We already started off in a place where naturalism is struggling to get a foothold and go, because naturalism's only answer is, well, we don't really know where the universe came from, but obviously it did. And once it popped up, if you just have enough chances, then we happen to be the winner of the universal lottery, and it's all based on luck. You can see our discussion from the last episode on, playing roulette in Casablanca and how that would actually work out for you. The last example that I want to talk about, and this is the last one that's going to bring us in and conclude our episode tonight, is the journey from the beginning point of the universe to this finely tuned little planet that we find ourselves on today. Now, every single one of these, I'm going to admit from the start, is remarkably unlikely to be possible by chance alone, and each of them to varying degrees. But in none of them can I conclusively say, although we can get close, we can get very close, I don't believe necessarily in any of these that you can say conclusively the best example to the point where it absolutely excludes all others is the fingerprint of an intelligent designer. I don't know within any of these if you could actually say that. I think there are a couple that you maybe could. But on each one of these, I will be the first to admit, it is remarkably unlikely, nearly impossible in some cases, that random chance could account for these. However, it can't be excluded as a possibility. But what I want to propose to you is this. The journey from the beginning of the universe to where we are today, each one of these has to be piled one on top of another on top of another to get to the planet that we have today. And if at any step along the way we falter and we don't have this happen just right, we either end up with a planet incapable of supporting life, or we end up with a planet that is remarkably less friendly to life. I would argue impossible, but I mean, again, I'm going to leave it open. But I want you to think about each one of these and consider where this goes and what this looks like. Okay? Okay, number one. So we are going to need heavy metals to produce our galaxy and the planets in our galaxy capable of supporting life. Now, in the early universe, those heavy metals were not there. We need the first generation of stars to be born, and we need that first generation of stars to die. And we need them to die in such a way that they generate the next generation of stars. That journey, remarkably improbable. Possible, but remarkably improbable. But we need those stars to do some remarkable heavy lifting to get those elements to us today. And again, fine-tuning's fingertips are reaching out into all of this, screaming, it's not just improbable, it's basically impossible. But I don't want to count fine-tuning twice, okay? So we're not going to. But again, around the edges, fine-tuning is always going to be an issue here. So again, the need for heavy metals. And then what we're going to find is, to get to our little blue planet, we need a spiral galaxy. And not just any galaxy. We need a spiral galaxy that's not too big and not too small, because we're going to need the right building blocks to build our little planet and this galaxy along the way to get the Milky Way galaxy where we need it to be. We need it to be in the right place. We need it to be formed just the right way. A spiral galaxy is the only kind of galaxy that will really do. The other kinds of galaxies out there are not nearly as friendly for life, and very less likely that you're going to find life. We need it to be of the right age, and we need it to be, there's all these different things that we need it to be. But let's say, again, all of that happens, and you have this remarkably fortunate journey to bring together the Milky Way. Improbable, but not impossible. I'll be the first to admit. But then things start to get dicey. And then things start to become less and less probable. So we've had all these remarkable strokes of luck to get us from the beginning point of the universe to where we see the Milky Way formed. And now we've got to jump into our little solar system. Now, a lot of current theories will indicate that our solar system at one point in time had to have begun in the shining center of the Milky Way galaxy. And you always think of, we hear that, the bright and shining center of the universe. The bright and shining center of a galaxy is not a friendly place for life. There's a lot of bad things that are happening in that bright and shiny place in terms of radiation and planetary collisions and supernovas and all sorts of things that, if you're trying to build a nice house, that's not the neighborhood you want to live in. But unfortunately, that's the neighborhood where all the materials for building a good house are. And so at some point in time, our solar system began there and gathered up all of the materials it was going to need for us and our planets in our solar system. And then it moved, and it was ejected from that bright and shiny center of the galaxy out to the spiral arm where we find ourselves today. In one of the most remarkable events imaginable, instead of just being ejected from the galaxy altogether, we move from the bright and shining center out to that arm in the Milky Way galaxy. And we find ourselves out on one of the spiral arms. And remarkably, we find ourselves in this little solar system of ours with the perfect sun to burn for a very long period of time to support life on this planet. We find ourselves, and this was Newton's dilemma that he looked at. Newton recognized that the orbits of the planets in our solar system was exceptionally unlikely. We know how they orbit and we know how they function, but the question Newton asked was, how did they get that way in the first place? We spent an entire episode talking about Newton's dilemma. Please go back and watch it. But how did the orbits of the planets arrange themselves in such a perfect way that you have our very large neighbors, Jupiter and Saturn, floating just outside, far enough away from us that they don't cause us any problems, but near enough to us that they're able to block incoming asteroids and things like that from hitting us? You know, if we're old enough to remember the summer where the movie Armageddon came out and there was another asteroid movie, Deep Impact. Both of them came out, a couple of years after the Schumacher-Levy comet impacted on Jupiter, and it became all the rage in Hollywood to make movies about it. In those cases, what you saw was the enormously beneficial impact that Jupiter and Saturn and the large gas giants have on protecting our little planet and the planets on the interior of the solar system. And we simply attribute that to chance. And there are good theories that believe that Jupiter and Saturn have both moved in their orbits from where they originally started to where they've landed today, which is a wonderful thing, because a bad orbit for Jupiter swinging by every once in a while could make a real ugly day for us in our lives. So we see a perfectly designed solar system and sun to support life on this planet, exactly what it needs to have for long-lasting, fruitful life to develop, diverse life to develop on this planet. And then we look at the development of Earth itself and how at various times in our planet's early creation, we received just the right infusion at just the right time of just the right ingredients to produce a planet that was stable and possible to support all the diversity of life around us. And to put an exclamation point on that, the formation of our moon and the theories behind how we could have such a very large satellite orbiting the Earth reach into the realm of the impossible and the ridiculous. And the best theory that we have right now is that another planet collided with Earth early in our development, but not too early. And at that moment, it took from us the things that we didn't need that were going to hinder the development of life or the ability for life to flourish. And it gave us the things that we need to really allow life to flourish on this planet and allow for a stable planet that supports this diversity of life that we see around us. And all of that happened by chance. And not only did it happen by chance, but it happened with Earth in the perfect spot. And we talked about all of the zones of where Earth is located. And it's not just one little Goldilocks zone where we're not too hot and we're not too cold, we're just right. But it's all of these things that all come together. We're in the right place to produce liquid water without it being frozen water. We have the perfect orbit so that one side of our planet isn't constantly facing the sun and the other side is frozen, just like the moon is, where the moon has one side that's dark and one side that's light, and the problems that that would cause for life. We're not so close to the sun that all the water burns off. We're in just the right spot to allow for photosynthesis, and we happen to have the right sun that produces the right rays to allow for photosynthesis. We have an atmosphere that's thick enough to protect us, but not so thick that we can't see out and observe the universe around us so that we can make these scientific discoveries that spell all of this out. When you put all of this together and you look at example after example after example, the formation of the moon for me raises a point of that's impossible. That just simply could not have happened. And if you argue that it could have happened, it's so remarkably unlikely. Again, how often are two planets colliding ever a useful and productive thing? Where one planet takes away the bad things that you don't need and leaves behind the things that you do. That's what happens when the grocery store delivers groceries to your house. That is the product of effort and design. In all of this, you have to ask yourself the question, any single one of them, there's no question that we cannot exclude random chance as being a possibility. And I would never dream of saying, well, each one of these clearly proves that we were the product of an intelligent designer. Not true. That would be God of the gaps. But what I am going to suggest to you is this. The cumulative list of how our little planet got here shows the handiwork of an architect and an engineer. An architect who designed it and an engineer who built it. It does clearly show the handiwork of intelligence, not at any one step along the way, but the cumulative journey from nothing to our little planet. The best explanation is not, well, at each step along the way, we just kept getting lucky. How is that not God of the gaps? How is that not Lady Luck of the gaps? When you look at each step along the way, the best explanation, the cumulative effect of that journey to our blue planet floating in space, the best explanation is clearly the hand of an intelligent designer. And by designer, I mean architect and engineer. Somebody who designed it, somebody who built it. That's how all those coincidences come into play. I've lived life long enough to know coincidence does not happen very often. And it definitely does not happen that many times. So in the journey to get here, I would propose to you that we have 3 clear examples. The jump from nothing to everything, the fine-tuning of the universe, and the fine-tuning of our little blue planet floating here in space. Each one of those 3 on its own clearly represents the fingerprint of an intelligent designer. And that is the best explanation. Not because, well, we're waiting for science. Science will come up with a better answer. That is based on the most current science. And when you look at each one of those, the more time goes on, the less likely it is that a naturalistic solution is going to be put into place. And in fact, I would argue, the longer we go on, the more we simply prove the point that the best explanation for each one of these is simply an intelligent designer. We have crossed the Rubicon. We have reached the point where each one of those 3, I believe we can say, the weight of the evidence clearly points to an intelligent designer. And I think the case is made based on the strength of the journey. That is where we are going to stop today. Next week, we are going to look at this question of the journey from lifelessness to life. And we're going to talk about that at length. And again, take the same journey. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I know I was moving along a little quickly, but we've got a lot of information to cover. Please go back. There are lots of episodes where we spent weeks on end talking about some of these various things. If you've got more questions, please go back and review some of those previous episodes on those topics. If you enjoyed today's episode, I really hope you'll stick with us for next week's episode where we start to draw a final conclusion. Hopefully we can get through all of that next week. If you did, I hope you'll consider hitting the like button for the podcast, for the episode, and the subscribe button for the podcast, or follow us on iTunes. You can find lots of good information on our website at prooftograce.com. You can reach out to us via email at prooftograce@yahoo.com. And you can always find our podcasts on YouTube, iTunes, and Spotify. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you'll stay with us next week. I hope you're enjoying this series, and I hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.